Well, good evening. It's good to be with you. We were planning this in July last year, so that's how far you've, in a sense, book up the schedule, if you like. And it's been a crazy week. But thank you to Kevin and the group for inviting me to share around Australian spirituality. I'm encouraged that at the start of the year, in a sense, you're thinking about the context of where these debates and discussions around faith and spiritual issues is taking place. So it's a worthwhile activity to be doing it. Now, for my background, I'm a third culture kid. I grew up in Papua New Guinea. I've been living with different cultures. My mum was New Zealander, my dad was Australian. And yes, there are some differences, even though people... But ultimately, my own faith journey took me to lecture in a theological college in central Nigeria around a place called Jos, where we were working with a denomination of about 6 million at the time, training some of their church leaders. But since then, I've continued to build on the experience. Now, in the mid-90s, when we came back, because our son had disability issues, so for me, my life has been around culture and engaging with those from other cultures. Now, for me, that shapes a little bit of my journey. I'm currently working on a PhD around the theme of cultural intelligence and looking at cultural intelligence amongst clergy here in South Australia, in light of the growing diaspora that are coming to Australia, bringing their Christian faith with them. But cultural intelligence is this capability to function effectively across various cultural contexts, such as national, ethnic, organisational, generation, etc. So this capacity to relate cross-culturally, and it can be expressed through the drive and the motivation, through the knowledge of understanding what takes place, and thinking through the strategy of how do I engage someone different. And that's what I'm building on tonight, right? This is where this topic fits into the discussion. A little bit of trying to understand how do we engage those who think differently spiritually? How do we process that? And then obviously there's action that flows on from that engenders the relationship, builds bridges. So for me, cultural intelligence is a really significant term. And this is what will shape my presentation tonight. Now, I don't know all your backgrounds. I'd love to spend some time understanding that to try to pitch this at the right level, because I'm not sure where all of you are coming from. So this is sort of potentially introductory. If you feel free to use the question time to take me deeper into this, because I just don't know where you're at in processing it and the interest in this subject. But for me, I want to present it from this angle of us having intelligence when we engage cross-culturally. And particularly for those of us from the Christian community, that's what we're dealing with when we're relating beyond our community, right? We're not just dealing with people necessarily who think like us. Yes, culturally they may be, ethnically they may be, but there are some significant differences. So I shape it this way, that what we're dealing with is actually a cross-cultural communication activity, right? Where we're trying to encode a message in a way that can be decoded, right? Now, no matter which side we're on in the debate, right, and the discussion, we've all got messages that we want to communicate in this field of religion and spirituality, right? And we want them to encode and process what we're saying and understand. So that's the decoding practice. So integral to this process is the respondent, the audience, the one doing the listening. It's not us as the communicator. And that's where, for me tonight, this particular topic fits in. Because what happens is that often in this communication process, there is a whole lot of noise. If I put a jackhammer outside there, What are you concentrating on?
Oh, you.
No, you're doing very well. You're doing very well if you can concentrate. There's all this noise around, and it just distracts you from understanding and processing it. But it's also helping us to put through messages in a way that people actually understand. Sorry?
Who's died?
Ah, yes. Yes, I know. So for me, this is the framework where this, for me, Australian spirituality. Now, many of you are coming from a part of the Christian community, and you're looking at how to engage beyond that. That's right, Kevin? Yes, generally. And so therefore, for me, this is helping us to understand the context in which we're operating. And so why potentially study it? And I think for me, there's not only this communication framework of helping us to improve our communication, it's also understanding the biblical foundation, particularly seen in Paul in Acts 17. And I'm sure that's a very strong part of reasonable faith that undergirds the thinking, is how Paul operated in Athens and took things that he saw, that he read, that he heard, talked it, and it opened up the opportunity for him to share about God to the key religious leaders and the people interested at the Areopagus, which was like the big church council. I look at Paul talking to the state parliament or 20 people in Adelaide trying to engage Parliament House. That's what it would have been like for Paul. But he gives us a model. He understood what was going, and it helped to shape his message. So for me, the way Paul introduced it, like in 23, for as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription. Right? He was understanding how they saw God, and he was able then to respond to that and start there and take them forward, which he does later on. Now, I haven't got time to unpack that, but for those of you within the Christian tradition, this passage is actually very formational for me in shaping how I think about engaging with those who are outside my world. So I've built this acronym around relating to people of other faiths, around the idea of relate. And that's what we're doing, we're relating. We're relocating from our Christian haven and refuge. We're esteeming and respecting those who are on the spiritual quest. We're listening and learning. We're analysing and addressing. We're telling the gospel contextually. We're entrusting the results to God and relying on the Holy Spirit. So for me, this undergirds my practice. Now, the consequences of doing this are what? If we ignore some of these principles, we don't understand our audience. I was in Melbourne over Christmas. We were in Federation Square on a Saturday night. Right? This really thoroughfare place. And there's 4 guys standing there shouting at the top, "You're all sinners." Right? You're all sinners, you're all going to hell. Right? We've seen that sort of character, and we get them here in Adelaide and that. But what good is that? They're just shouting. Who's connecting? Who's understanding that? There's a whole lot of noise, but it's just going over. And we tried to engage them a little bit around some of these sorts of issues, but we didn't get very far. But the consequences are that you don't connect. You lose, your message gets lost in that. So understanding our audience is a part of it. Who are we relating to? Who are we connecting with? And that's part of where I want us to go as we look at Australian spirituality. But before we do that, in a sense, we've got to define spirituality. Spirituality is different from religion, but related. Spirituality is the term people are using more than religion these days. But religion is more about organised beliefs and practices of a given group, such as the rules like an organised game of football or something like that. Right? To be religious does not necessarily mean one is spiritual. You can ask me questions on that. But spirituality is referring to the sense of connection to something bigger than ourselves and informs meaning and purpose in life to the point of providing peace and contentment as such. So it's something more universal. It's something that touches us. It can involve engagement with an ultimate reality or a transcendent dimension, but does not necessarily have to do it. So it would be more like, let's have a good fun, let's kick the football around in the park, right, and have a good time without all the rules. And we've seen incidences of that around Adelaide in the park. So people just kicking around the football, or like in Nigeria for us. At the end of the day, there's all these informal games of soccer going on, right, without all the rules and the structure of a proper match. In a sense, that's what spirituality is about. It's finding that meaning for life and dealing with the spirit, the human spirit. But so how do we study spirituality? We can look at symbols. Right? We can look at narratives. Right? TV shows, books, films. Right? Now, the reason I say that is many of you are in this point of trying to understand the context and engaging. And so often we can present this information, but how much are we reading and listening to what's actually being said and coming through? Now, in many ways, I'm speaking here to the Christian community on this, that this process of listening and understanding where people are at is an important part of this process. There's also music, there's research and statistics, there's historical sites. What are sites telling us? It's interesting in Australia in the last 10 years, how many sites now where an accident takes place, we've got to put flowers there. 10 years ago that was really rare, or the odd person did it, but today everyone does it. You see all these shrines to sports people around flowers. That's trying to articulate a little bit of the meaning of life and trying to process death. You got language, school curriculum, and you got rituals and that in society. So there's plenty of ways for us to study and learn about our context. And I want to encourage you in that, for those of you who are serious, to really understand that. Not just understand your field and what our Christian presentation, but actually understand what's happening on the other side. What's understanding? And I suppose that's what I've done over the years. But there's some things to acknowledge, some qualifiers in looking at this and in a presentation like this. One is, this is a secondary perspective because I'm in the Christian world. The other worlds I'm not necessarily part of. So in a sense, you're reporting secondhand, right? And trying to document. There's too many variables to generalise. Because Australian spirituality, is there one? I'll challenge that tonight. There's not one expression of an Australian spirituality. And there's too many variables then to generalise what that is. There's some trends and some clues to what's going on, but it's not necessarily one expression. Time to cover all of to cover the many options is also very difficult. So I'm introducing some themes and trying to give you the big picture, not bury down into one perspective. The role of experience is really important, that all of us have had maybe different experiences in this area, and that shapes our response. And I appreciate that and recognise that. Recognise the perceived negativity towards Christianity. And this is part of the challenge when you start to look at Australian spirituality, is in many ways some of it is a critique of Christianity. And that may be hard for some of us in the Christian community to actually process that. But they're speaking. We need to be listening. And again, the difference between religion and spirituality. Now, if I asked you, and I'm probably more an interactive person rather than just a speaker, but if I asked you for some things about what tells us is happening in our world in terms of spirituality, what are some of the things, behaviours and things that we're seeing that may give us some clues about Australian spirituality?
Pluralism.
Sorry?
Pluralism.
Pluralism, okay, yep. So how does that manifest itself?
negativity towards Christian faith as people get angry because we think that we're the only ones going to heaven.
Okay, yep. Negativity. I'll abbreviate there. Yep, okay.
The issue of attendance at church, you know.
Okay, yep.
Declines so greatly.
Okay, church attendance is declining, yep.
I've noticed I get a lot of sort of insights. They vary in quality, but a lot of good stuff as well as rubbish. Comes to me via little memes on Facebook.
Okay.
As a way of people to share encouragement and spiritual truisms.
Mm-hmm. So that's how you spell it. Yeah, memes. Yeah. So social media, yep. Sorry?
I haven't seen the technology.
I've never seen the technology before. We're just waiting for that spiritual. There's something going on.
Yeah, it's like a screen and there's this plastic pen and I can save it.
Fantastic. I was going to say music. There's a lot more listening to music.
So what's that telling? What's the actual action in listening?
Looking for the content, word.
It's okay. Search for meaning. I think music. So what we're starting to see here is there's still searching going on in amongst what is happening. So we're trying to look for contentment. The contentment, something that will relax me, something that de-stresses me.
But the wrong opposite as well.
Yes.
You want to get carried away with
Mm-hmm.
feeling or
Yep.
kind of
Yep.
idolise and you have your eye or something.
Yep.
It's a little bit 2015 now, but mindfulness.
Yep.
Well,
I'll actually
a
put.
bit more all the rage last year than this.
Yep. The rise of the colouring book. The colouring book is an interesting. I think at Christmas, the colouring book was within the top 10 of books sold in Australia for Christmas. The colouring, just a plain colouring book.
I'd say sport.
Yep, sport. Yeah.
Yes, it is.
Oh, there's some trends in there.
Yes, sub-trends.
Yeah.
Environmentalism has a spirituality
Yes. Yeah.
aspect to it.
Yeah.
A number of people.
There's also, I think, a very good movement to try and bring a bit more nature into
Mhm.
education.
Yeah.
Not always, but some
Yeah.
around that. On that.
Yep.
Recognition of Aboriginal spirituality and acknowledgement of country.
Yep.
etc.
Yep. 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 Diversity. Yep. Yeah. Yep.
A desire for sovereignty nationally versus globalism. And that's a behavioural thing, I think, that comes down.
Yeah, what's reflecting that? I suppose that's where I'm bearing down. Globalism's happening, but what's it impacting us?
A sense of isolation versus
Yep.
inclusiveness.
Yep.
I'd say donations and sponsors.
Sorry?
Watching children and things like that.
The social act, the justice. Mm.
I reckon farmers markets and
Yeah.
food and that is indicating something too.
Yep.
People's interest in all that.
Put that down here is farmers, organic. All right. That's interesting. It's a very different list to what I've got. Very interesting list. I think there's only one there that two there that I would double up on. So that's interesting.
Give us some of yours.
I will. The church attendance is an obvious one, and I'll talk about that. Use of religious terminology, like karma.
Yep.
Right? 10 years ago, you wouldn't be talking about karma, but everyone talks about karma. The rise of New Age events and festivals, like in the showgrounds, the mind-body expos, right? And that's been growing. The 7-day a week with no Sabbath. The rise of the megachurch, right? We do away with small churches and let small churches die. Meditation, yoga, Pilates, all those sorts of things that build on that mindfulness. Over 75% of marriages are now civil celebrant. When, 10 years ago, 75%.
10 years ago.
It would have been about 50 or under 50. It was growing. The dislocation features of escapism, etc., the rise of heroism, binge drinking, suicide, depression. The high adventure seekers. So there's a whole lot in that. So that's the behavioural aspect of that. Right? And that's what we tend to focus in on, is the behaviour. Right? What they do. Because that's what we see. But actually, when you look at the definition of culture, you actually see that it's a coping mechanism belonging to and operated by a society of not just concepts and behaviours, but the underlying perspectives, the worldview. Right? The worldview. And from that then flows the customs, the rituals and the artefacts. So what's worldview? The structured assumptions, values, commitments, allegiances underlying a people's perception of reality and their responses to those perceptions. And really that's what we're trying to wrestle with a little bit in the Australian context. What are some of those values that are undergirding that? And I depict it through concentric circles like this with the worldview that flows beliefs and values. And really, if we're going to understand Australian spirituality, we look at the behaviour, but we've actually got to go deeper. We've actually got to go deeper and try to understand that. So let's have a look at some of these beliefs and values that in many ways is being affected by globalisation. So what you were saying is the globalising versus the local has really changed Australia. So a lot of what we're reporting now has probably become more pronounced since about the mid-80s. And if you actually look at the mid-80s, that's when you started to get international TV a lot more. You started to switch the international communication, became a lot more accessible. I mean, it was 91 when we had the Iraq War live into our homes. You may remember that. Watching that at night and the night vision and all that. So that whole world has just opened up. And so a lot of what we're experiencing now in Australia in terms of spirituality has changed because we've become more part of the world.
I can't remember before the whole international television thing in the mid-80s.
Yeah.
But I certainly reckon that what you're just saying really, really applies since everyone had internet.
Oh, internet's even more. Even more.
You know, like TV.
Yeah. Now you do, what is it, Stan, Netflix, Presto, all those options, and you're watching stuff live. You're not waiting for, up to 6 to 8 months to see the new show. We're getting it within 24 hours.
But in terms of the plethora of ideas.
Yes. Yeah, and the sharing of ideas and blogs, Twitter, Facebook and all that. So globalisation is really behind a lot of what's happening here in a number of ways. It's not just the technology. For me, it's migration. Migration, if you actually look at the Australian migration, it's only the 70s that we opened our doors to beyond really the Western European type countries. You know, it's only early 70s, mid 70s, 40 years of that. So let's go for a walk through the supermarket then, the spiritual supermarket. And this is an image that I think is helpful to understand Australian spirituality. As I said before, there is not one Australian spirituality. There's many, and they're in a supermarket. It's like we go shopping. Right? We go shopping. So I want to take you down some of the aisles. Now, how many of you go down the dog food aisle? Okay, there's about 3. How many? Most of us probably don't. I don't go down the dog food aisle. I wonder why. Don't have a dog. So I just totally bypass that aisle, right? Because it doesn't have any relevance to me, right? But most of us probably, and it's interesting how they position the supermarket structure, don't they? What they put right in the front there, which is the veggies. Not that most people still walk through the veggie section and totally bypass it, but veggies, most people stop. One of the core products, we all need it, it's right there in front of us. Right? So we make choices as we go through that supermarket. And in many ways, we've got many aisles in the Australian supermarket, a religious, spiritual supermarket. Right? So let's have a look at a couple of these and how they're performing or not performing. So the Christian aisle, which is probably the one because this is part of our community, and it's also part of the history of this nation. As you can see, in 1901, 96% in the census said they were Christian. Right? So we're basically British, New Zealand and a few other countries feeding into Australia at the time. So the Christian heritage was incredibly strong. Now that's federation. That's part of our foundation. But as you can see, as you went through time, to 2011, it's now down to 60%. So is that really a performing aisle? Well, if you were the supermarket manager, I don't know, anyone's worked in a supermarket? And shelving and looking at where your products are going, what's going to happen to this product then on the basis of the... Less space, bottom shelf. Right? Okay, so that's some of that data is part of what's happening. So it tends to get pushed further away because it's not necessarily performing in the way that we'd like.
Although interestingly, it doesn't appear to me that 61% of people that you meet are Christian.
No.
And certainly 96% weren't
Christian.
In the 01 census, it was ticked one of the boxes, and it was the Christian denominations.
Yeah.
And so the other 4% was people who
didn't. A lot of that, didn't identify with that. And there's a lot of flaws in using that method. If you match that with church attendance, what are you looking at? 5%, under 5%, actually on church 2 times a month or something. You're getting down to 1-2%. If you actually look at that. But I suppose in terms of Australian spirituality, there's still a Christian flavour because there's still people identifying in that. Now there's a whole lot of nominalism and all that around it. And we haven't got time to unpack some of that, the deeper detail, because I'm trying to, I suppose, look at the broad picture. But look at the decline in just 10 years. The vast majority of what's propping up this data are probably the over 50s. You probably agree with me. So in the next decade, and it'll be interesting this year, what will that drop off will be. And the change will come if that gets below 50%, which is another, I think, a big issue on the horizons for us as a country. If that percentage falls under 50, what does that actually mean? Sort of thing. So, but anyway, that's down the track. That's fine.
So just quickly, are you extending your analogy to actually that supermarket shelf to actually what's happening in the media, the reason we're seeing the media?
Oh, there's a lot of factors that are contributing to this. Yeah, and the way it's...
I was just wondering if that's what you're saying, the numbers also contribute to the way that negativity in the media and stuff because they don't want to...
No, I think there's some other factors behind that. Okay, so what part of this is looking at, okay, this Christian side is still happening, but it's declining. Okay, I suppose that's one of the Christian aisle is declining, it's getting more pushed aside a little bit. Sorry, yeah?
You could say that people are more prepared to say what they really think now.
Yeah.
I think in the earlier years, if you said you weren't Christian, there'd be shock and horror in the families. And this is just a more open, pluralistic society.
Yeah.
That could be part of the reason for the changes.
And there's a big gulf between the over 50s and the under 50s.
So churches have actually peaked in between, like about halfway through the century, not...
Yeah.
It wasn't on the slide all the way through the
No.
century.
I mean, 71 is still pretty, yeah. It's really come in post-Whitlam. I think Whitlam started something and then out of that's grown into the 80s. But if you look at Australian history, it's basically the internationalist era is about 85 onwards, where we sort of came out of being this remote island at the bottom of the world, or unless you're top of the world if you have your upside down map, but at the bottom of the world, totally disconnected because transport was difficult and etc. But we've opened up. So the Christian Isle. Now there's a whole lot more around that, and it's interesting. One of the studies that was done in 2011 by Mark McCrindle. I don't know whether people know Mark. Really interesting document. Now I haven't got time to unpack this, but he's done a whole lot of research with a group called Olive Tree Media in 2011 and produced some interesting stats around Christianity in Australia and the decline, but done it through different graphics. So church attendance so if you look at the ever increasing in terms of the age of the church compared to the percentage of the population. And then some of their work on beliefs and attitudes towards Christianity. Okay, so there's this incredible change that's taken place. So Christianity is still the dominant group, but it's on the slide. And will increasingly be on the slide if you take out this percentage, 38% of the Christian population is over 60. That's almost 1 in 2. Now there is a document that they did, which I'll show you, but I haven't got time to unpack. That may be something it's the Australian Communities Report. And this has been really influential in shaping some of my thinking over the last few years in this area. So I was looking at the influences on review, Australians and religion. But one of the biggest impacts on this one is what are the blockages to Christianity? Why are people moving away? First one, church abuse, which goes with the sexual abuse, which is a major issue. Hypocrisy, judging others. Where do you really start to get down to the apologetics? You start to get to suffering. Issues around money, outdated. Where's the the traditional apologetic issues? They're way down the list compared to some of those other top things which are about relationships.
Yeah, I think judging others and religious wars are about apologetic issues as well.
Yeah, in terms of the way, I suppose with new atheism they pick up on the walls and religion at the heart of it, yes. But judging others, the hypocrisy is about living and relating, just as much as it is about the knowledge and the content. One of our staff members here has been heavily involved in the discussions around and advocating for some of the victims from the sexual abuse. I mean, there's horrific stories. How do you grapple with that? And then you got the beliefs about Jesus. Sorry?
Church abuse is kind of
a bit broader.
Very recent phenomenon. Is it in the media?
Yeah, it's probably the last 10 years it's really snowballed. But it's big.
Was it a big factor before because it was all covered up?
It was covered up. Yeah. And victims didn't feel comfortable to speak out. But we've created an environment now, and our society's created an environment now to speak out. And survivors and victims have been able to connect more together through social media and other mediums to connect more and share their story more. And probably some of them have because they've got older. But some of the other interesting stuff is the challenge around miraculous.
I think one, it's a little bit off topic, but it's on
Okay.
topic of what we're talking about there. I think one of the answer back to that sort of thing is that sexual abuse happens in and out of organisations, right? It happens in and out of religion.
Yeah.
It's only that when there is an institution where you can collect your blame towards, and so that's the phenomenon. It's not that I don't think that there's.
I think it's more than that. There is the denial that's going on.
I think it's the trust, the hypocrisy of that, and the moving of people, of clergy, and not actually facing up to the.
But that I know.
Which is also there's a lot.
Just on that,
Yeah.
I know of a case. I know the case very well, where a child in the 80s was taken to the children's hospital with internal injuries from abuse and sent home, and it was not followed up. Right? That's a secular institution. It's about the time. It was.
Yeah, but what's going on now is they're denying.
Yeah, well, that's wrong.
Whereas in a secular institution now, there's no escape.
But the
Yeah.
church always they claim high moral ground.
Yeah, I think that's the difference between the secular is what we stand for, and that's where the.
But does anyone jumping up and down about kids being sent home with clear sexual abuse from the children's hospital?
Yes, they are. They are. Yeah. Some of the other institutions have been. This place has been studied. Not that it was Tabor's part, but this place has been studied as an orphanage.
Yeah.
So they've gone back. They've certainly dealt it. We've just had a number of cases here in Family SA that reflects that same outrage. So that's a useful report if you want to explore that a little bit more in terms of looking at the Christian aisle. And that's probably where so we're still a big player, but its shape and its look's going to change over time. But what are what's replacing that, if we go back, and what's replacing that sort of 40%? Who's filling that in? And that's where we start to look at Australian spirituality. So you've got one group, which is the Christian group, right? And what are the Christians going to do? They're going to go shopping in the Christian aisle, right? They're not going to bypass the Christian aisle, okay? They're going to engage in it. Although more and more are opting out from actually engaging the aisle in a way. They may skim it, or they'll move more to the margins, with groups or opting out of church altogether.
I think it's a good way to describe it is previously people might buy a whole package, but now you can buy all the ingredients and mix it together. In your own style.
That's right, and that's what this is really highlighting, is there's a lot more selection, and our nature and our culture and our worldview is allowing selection. And that's around individuality. But let me just present a couple of the others.
Have you defined a Christian yet?
Sorry?
Have you defined a Christian?
Not here. Christian is the broad category. For the census is all the Christian denominations. Right across the spectrum. That's what the census data, so that'd be Catholic, Anglican.
So you're using denomination as the basis for...
Yeah, but there's other categories or other Christian. There's another, isn't there? I think there's another... A Christian, there that people can fill in without actually identifying with a denomination. And I think also the Pentecostal world is just Pentecostal. It's not all the sort of independent Pentecostal churches. So it doesn't really cater for that. So there is a place to put other Christians. So it's the broad family. It's not
What I'm saying is that's challengeable in its own right. That sort of definition I find I'd like to challenge. Using denominations as the definition, as a way of...
Well, that's what the census does. I'm using census.
People basically self-identify, don't they?
Yeah, because you put it, it's what you tick. It's what you tick.
In these limited boxes.
On the census. Yeah, but that's I'm trying to present a picture.
Is there anyone who writes anything that's some form of Christian?
Would be included in it, yeah.
It all ends up in the total number of Christians so-called in census. So.
Just the methodology is a bit...
Yeah, but that's, I don't know how else we do a collective picture. Access it. It's the closest we've got to that.
The most visible.
Yeah. I mean, there are surveys and you can take them as representative samples, but they're not necessarily, getting that representation is... Okay, other religions. So you have another part of Australian spirituality which is growing. It's now getting up to around 15%. 15%, I think, is where you've got of the major faiths of Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism, Islam, Judaism, yeah. So those major faiths that have basically come through migration, right? And were very small in that 1971 census. So a lot of the growth has been through migration. So you're getting these other major religions coming in. So people in their communities are in their religion. Then there's the big area of growth is the no religion. And this is fraught with danger because of the way it's interpreted and the way it's classified and that. But putting that aside, let's just see. What it's just telling us is an incredible growth in that, particularly amongst the younger ones. The under 30s, under 40s are really putting in this category, and they're not replacing it with another spiritual or religious thing. And so this is the area, in terms of Australian thinking about the spirit and meaning of life, is becoming a larger cohort. Still reasonably small if you put it in light of the numbers, 1 in 5 or so.
Much bigger in South Australia.
Yes, okay, yeah.
About 5% extra in
It's
South Australia.
about 28, isn't it? 20.
Yeah.
Yeah. So therefore there's this now group of those who are not seeing a place for any religion. And really that's the area that I think is a lot more thought needs to go into. So what's feeding it? And it's interesting, this report from ABS that came out in 2013 on the reporting of no religion and the analysing of it. So you can see the growth, but looking at in terms of the categories by type of view held. Hopefully you can see. Then you're looking at the age of some of those. Right? Age and sex. So you can see, so there's an incredibly valuable study of looking at that category of breaking down and how it's mainly amongst the younger ones and the gap between their Christian parents or those who would see themselves as nominating Christianity to their kids and the big disconnect there. And that may be part of some of your families too. I know it's part of my family. I'm the only one really involved in the church out of 4 kids. And my generations before that were heavily involved in church. My parents were heavily involved in church. So what's influencing that? Secularism, right? It's thinking of the worldview and the view of the world, saying there's no understanding of the world beyond the physical, right? That's part of the worldview, the assumptions and that thinking is part of that process. Right? Thinking about life is about now, so there's no supreme being, there's no supernatural, etc. And with that comes, what do you put that in its place? The place of science becomes really important in that process. So we do everything to prolong life, right? Science and proof becomes really integral to understanding our way around this world. So science has filled some of that void that would have been done with the supernatural and understanding the mystery and understanding God. We've got the whole area of new atheism, which is an expression of that, which has really risen up in amongst some of this group, and we understand that. Now, it's probably not a term some of you may identify with, but in sort of... Sorry? Probably a key proponent would be guys like Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins is a strong advocate in that field, the terminology of this is more used in the Christian world but it's a really, I suppose by saying new atheism, it's the new wave of it and new expressions of it, yeah. And it's a revitalisation of probably what was strong in the late 60s, early 70s. So it's like a rebirthing of it.
I think the difference that categorises the new atheism is they want to stand out religion.
Yeah.
Whereas previously, at least in the Western world, the old atheism was like they were happy just to ignore it.
Yeah.
Now they want to stand it out politically and spiritually.
They're probably stronger with our aids of communication and that.
Yes.
And media and all that have really latched on it, because there's now this freedom that this is now a viable position. It's no longer a little minority stuck at the back of the supermarket, if you like, in the back shelves, gathering mould or, sort of tucked away. It's now become more prominent. And so therefore it's more towards the front of the aisles in the supermarket.
Angry and aggressive.
Well, and there's a lot of that's coming from people's experience too, and etc. But yeah, certainly there's been a greater push in that.
I think that's the connotation.
So coming with that is postmodernism, the whole idea that we've moved away from the modern world and there's almost a postmodern world. Some are now talking about a postmodern world. Affluenza then. So what's filling this void for people then, if we're moving away from religion and searching for the meaning of life, right? So there's this move towards there's no God and to science trying to resolve the answers to some of the world's problems. But affluenza's fed down. I've got to get more money, more wealth, right? The drive to succeed becomes stronger because you're searching for meaning. So meaning comes out of what I've got to show my friends and my networks and my group. So affluenza, so we see this rise in cosmetic surgery, right? In finance. So what are we trying to do? We're trying to improve our human body, right? Instead of maybe accepting who we are and finding a way of managing that. We're restless.
Does this fill a void, or does it push Christianity out? Understand what I mean? Is it
It's a both and.
It's Christianity, or is it actively displacing Christianity?
Both. It's a both and, I would think. Because the more you get caught in this, the more likely you move away from all religion, right? And so as you move away from religion, you then put up barriers, or not barriers, but potentially you don't want to engage it anymore. So you're moving away from Christianity, but you haven't, why? And I think that's the critique for us out of this, and I'm conscious of time, that you're moving away because you haven't found satisfaction in it, so you've gone looking, and that pushes you away further. And you get caught, you're getting caught up in that world that you don't want to then engage Christianity.
You mentioned surgery. What about tattooing, which is a huge
Tattooed?
interest?
Yes, yeah.
You wearing what you believe on
Yourself, yeah, and the whole body image stuff reflects who people are searching for, who they are. The whole identity thing, particularly in this group. It's not necessarily in the Christian world, although some of the Christians would be, it's not exempt in the other religions, but certainly in this sort of these aisles in the supermarket around these things are seeing some of that. And technology is adding some of those things too. Then there's New Age spirituality, which is another whole new aisle, or several aisles. Now, New Age spirituality covers probably about 32, 35 different spiritual activities or processes. I haven't got time to unpack that. But so these are becoming more and more towards the front of the supermarket. These 20 years ago would only be maybe one shelf in the supermarket, if that. It was all seen as weirdo. So you had TM, Transcendental Meditation, in the 70s, for example. And it was really a taboo sort of, people stayed away from it. Why now that whole world has been brought to the fore. Now I haven't got time to really unpack that, but yoga, the prominence of yoga, churches running yoga classes, or having yoga on their premises, schools are doing yoga, The whole thing of health around that. But then there's the occult, the channeling, you have the tarot card readings, you have astrology on radio, mainstream radio. 10, 15 years ago, an astrologer on radio. Now you've got a whole hour, I know, on 5AA, I think, in the evening, early mornings, I think, on the weekends. I think you can get, well, you used to have someone with astrology, and that was just constantly being booked out. They almost had to pre-book their phone call. They couldn't just ring in. So you've got these different sources feeding into this, and I suppose the manifestation of that is the mind, body, soul sort of expo, where down the showgrounds here gets plenty of attention and attendance. So basically the concept of that is all is one, therefore all is God, all religions are one, man is God. If you look through the logic, I haven't got time to unpack that. And that's probably simplistic, but it stems from Hinduism and Buddhism, a lot of that thought, around what we call what we call monism, where everything's one. Right? So that's a totally different mindset to the person who says no religion, to the person who's looking at the Christian aisle. Right? So therefore, in the supermarket, you've got all these choices. And as it was said before, people are selecting what is relevant for them. Right? And so that raises, this little quick survey raises some core features, and then I'll get closer. Some core features, such as individually based now. It's not the community, it's not the family. It's post-religion, post-tradition, post-structure. Right? So there's a lot more freedom in managing and of choice. Right? It's not like you have to toe the family line. I can believe what I want to believe. The need for tolerance then, because basically all paths lead to God then, so there's not one right way to go. This one's the interesting one for me, the pragmatic and the authentic. It has to work. And that's why people go look shopping, don't we? We look for food products that are going to help us or help our diet. Right? So in some way people are doing that in the spiritual supermarket. They're looking at things that are going to work and meet their needs, whether it's a colouring book, whether it's some meditation, whether it's some yoga. Right? But you talk to people who do yoga and ask them, do you understand where yoga fits into Hinduism and some of those belief systems? Most people wouldn't even know that connection. And we've had those conversations in our primary school a few years ago where they introduced yoga into my son's class, and we just asked just some questions like that. And it was interesting, the teachers weren't aware of all that. They just saw it purely as a physical activity. Didn't realise that and I suppose part of that is the separation then of our physical world from the spiritual world, which comes with a lot of this world, around the worldview of postmodernism, the post-structure. The demise of mystery, it's about the now and what we can see, do, etc. And then no accountability. In a sense, a big move away from religion relates to accountability and authority. So therefore, I want to take control of my own actions. I don't need to be accountable to a God or to another being. So the whole thing of authority then becomes that. And so therefore I can choose what I want to do because I'm controlling my own destiny and my own spirit. So there's a very strong individual flavour with this. And that raises some questions and some challenges. So where to from here? Sorry about that was a quick, and there's a whole lot we can embed in that. But I think the key thing is that there's a real diversity of spiritual elements out there. We need to be working with the individual. Right? Everyone's selecting what fits for them. So where does this leave the church? Right? The church is very much being displaced as the centre. So we're going from being in the town square to being on the town border. Being in the front of the supermarket and a dominant product and a well-known product in the supermarket to something that's less known. Because you don't have to go down the Christian aisle, you can avoid that. You don't have to engage engage it. So therefore, there's a whole lot around the institution then. The church is an institution. But can I encourage us, we're not the only institution struggling. We're not the only institution struggling. What else is struggling? Political party, yeah, the political parties.
Bowling clubs.
Bowling clubs, yeah. Service clubs, your surf life-saving clubs. Commitment to membership is less and less and less.
But things like scout groups and Girl Guides.
Yeah, a lot of them are struggling. Yeah. And the Rotaries and the Apexes and a lot of those that were around community and help function community and now are struggling because they're the same ethos and values are impacting that. So we're not the only institution. We're not the only institution that's actually struggling in that way.
There's no need to have real friends when you can have 1,000
Facebook friends, yes, yeah. And in many ways the church is aligned to that modern era, so we're in postmodern, post-structure. The way the church can't be trusted, which is this issue of authority and power, and the way that's been used, and I suppose the child sex sort of issues the church has faced has been about power. Christianity is implicated as a guilty party, and so therefore there's an anti-church sort of feeling in some of the problems of this world as part of the institutions. And Christianity fails to provide some of the answers. The privatisation of the faith, right? As we individualise it, that's my privacy. I don't need to share it with anybody else. So that's a challenging space for us. But the question for me, is this a threat or an opportunity? And for those of us in the Christian world, if we see it as a threat, what are we likely to do? Withdraw, react, defensive, aggressive. If we see it as an opportunity then, there's a far more way of looking through this. And we're not the only one, if you look through church history, as Matt Gray would tell us, we're not the only era to struggle with this particular position. Few others over the centuries have as well, of being in the minority and struggling to find a voice. So what is the way forward? And a key value for me in thinking about this, acceptance is the ability to communicate value and worth and esteem to another person. In the process of dealing with individuals is thinking about acceptance. We don't necessarily agree with their values necessarily, and there's room to do, but how do we communicate a way of value and of worth and esteem in their search? And Romans 15:7 becomes important. Accept one another then, just as Christ accepted you, in order to bring praise to God. So, my motto is be prepared. The Good Scouts motto. Right? Pray seeking God's power intervention. God's the only one that's going to intervene in some of these. We've gone away as a church from prayer and recognising this is God's mission. Rediscover Jesus and the gospel. Who's Jesus? And not a lot of our focus within the church has been to sell the church rather than to sell Jesus.
But even remember, we had Jesus All About Life.
Yes.
Where Jesus was put as the prominent thing, but even then it was connected to church events and activities.
There is, yeah. I engage the critique of what's going on. What's this telling us about us as a church? And that's what keeps my mind active in this, is people are speaking. Right? Just like marketers and products and producers are looking at what's happening on the shelves. If their product is not selling, what are they going to do? Just give up? Yeah. They're going to go back and look at their packaging, look at their product, do a whole lot more research to understand and come back and maybe with the product revamped in order to connect to the market. Proclaim testimony. Our stories are just as important. Our stories of faith and how those of us in the community, how have we found God? Act credibly, authentically and with integrity. That addresses some of that hypocrisy and some of those issues of judgment. My sister's not really in church. My next one down in my family is not in church, partly, or has been active in the church because as a teenager she was told she could not wear jeans to church. And that just did it. Relate beyond one's comfort zone, because in many ways we're going out of our comfort zone. embrace God's activity in the world, and then develop healthy values and resilience. Because can be tough yards, hanging in with people, being patient, having a long-term perspective. So be prepared. And then the last question is, can the Christian community recover? Which is one that Kevin and I talked briefly about. Can Christianity recover? Well, that's up to God. Now, some of you might find that premise hard, and I appreciate that, but obviously coming from a Christian world and my understanding of what God can do. But look at the changes we saw in the early church, and the growth in that through to Constantine. But there are warnings, and it is hard when we look at Rome in 410. We're in a similar state. A lot of the issues Rome was facing are similar to today. But there are things that we can do. But I want to leave some idea for hope. This path in England is in the Lakes District. And we walked it last year with my wife and I, late one evening. So we just followed this path, not knowing where it was going. We were hemmed in, and we were just in one direction. At the bottom of it was a nice view, the beauty of it. But the idea of walking down the path, not knowing the difficulties and the challenges that we are facing within our Australian context in relation to the spiritual supermarket, it's challenging, but there is still beauty at the end with individual lives and people who are still being transformed. And in many ways, we look around the world, and my friends in Nigeria just telling stories. I'm getting incredible testimonies from God's power, and it's only God doing it. It's not a human thing doing it, particularly in the Middle East. And that's another whole saga. So our God is still a changing God. Now, that mightn't be everyone's premise, and I appreciate that. But for me, with what I've seen of how God's just met people without any human invention, there was no way anything else but something divine. So there's still hope and beauty at the end. Thank you.
Thanks very much for your talk. Obviously stirred up a fair bit of interest. One of my privileges of directing it is I get to ask the first question. All right. So you describe how Christianity has actually been in decline in Australia. Is this decline inevitable as part of being a Western country, or is the church at fault for the decline?
Okay, good question. These are complex things. I'm trying to simplify it. There's so many variables and factors that I think are contributing to it. There's a number of things that have happened. People have travelled. So they've gone and seen more, right, than being locked into Australia, say, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. So people go to Bali, and what are you presented in Bali? Sorry? You've got a range of spirituality and sort of places. So people travel and see things. So that's a big part of people's world. And TV's bringing things into people's homes a lot more. And that sort of normalises the process. But at the same time, the way the church has handled things and the way we see our faith, I think, has also contributed. And this is in some way a critique for us as a church in terms of how we engaged in society, but also how we've processed where the world's changed. I don't think we as a Christian community, and it's hard to generalise because there's good examples and there's some that haven't, but generally we have not taken our people on this cultural change. Right? And if you look at the age groups there, one of the factors that I think is the reason for that is that with many people being over 60, they've retired. Right? So that period has got lost because they're not in the workplace grappling with those things. They're not necessarily in those worlds of conversation and community. So, and I think that, and they're operating from their paradigm or their coping mechanism for culture, from what they learned through the 40s and the 50s maybe, or even the 30s. their paradigm is still operating. And that paradigm doesn't go well in this modern world. And I think that's been one of the factors, and that's a cultural factor. So I think that's been one aspect of it. I don't think leadership have helped necessarily in terms of helping taking people on these journeys to explore these issues. And some of these issues that we've said about power and control and hypocrisy and that. And people have been hurt by the church in a range of ways. So I shared the example of my sister. We look at those who are victims of child sex abuse. There's people being cut off. I've got a number of friends who are broken because of experiences in handling difference. We don't handle difference well. We want everyone to assimilate and fit in to be like us. Rather than saying, you're a creator, you've been made in the image of God, how do we celebrate that? How do we embrace that? How do we maximise that? So you can be the person God wants you to be. Does that help? Or not?
Yeah, it's saying it's both, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's both. So the church is partly at fault, and also
there's stuff happening. It's just there's our pressures are outside, because more and more as they get up, as the media is more powerful than ever before, because it's 24/7 news cycles, and they're looking for scapegoats. They're looking for people to get into.
It sounds itsy bitsy. There's so many factors that's hard to kind of pinpoint.
That's right. There's not one
good factor that you can address.
No, but I think what's going is what's the worldview of the groups that are involved. So the media today would basically be coming out of that group of the no religion. Right? So therefore those who are in the Muslim community would be struggling with the media backlash against them just as much as we as Christians in many ways. Sorry?
Probably more.
Probably more, yeah. So therefore this is where we need to think about what groups are we talking about, rather than talking about the whole Australian population. And that's part of what I wanted to share tonight, the real diversity. So I think we've got to think about who are the people feeding us, and where are they coming from. And as we understand people's experiences, I think part of our job is to come alongside and appreciate the hurt, if they've been hurt by the church or got school experiences and that. I mean, I went to a religious school, and and even then in the 70s, I was virtually the only, there was a few of us who were Christians, but there weren't many. Even though they were in the church school, the faith doesn't really mean anything. So those things inoculate people as well. And that hasn't helped. But appreciate that it's complex. I think that's good to recognise that, because if we try to simplify it, it's just going to do our head in many ways.
And we try to understand the complexity, we also do our head in.
Yes.
Leonard.
One of the things that's changed across my medical lifetime was the concept of an explanation, which fits in with all of this. Because I asked the doctor how he got on once with the cross-cultural exercise of working in an African country. And he said, Western scientific medicine in Adelaide is now a cross-cultural exercise. Because with all of this range of spirituality and everything else, people's idea of what is a cause of why they're ill and what is a treatment for it all has changed massively too. And this is a strange parallel that's happened across my working lifetime in Australia.
Isn't medicine supposed to be evidence-based medicine?
But they don't want that anymore. They want, the alternate industry of medications is worth $1 billion a year more in Australia than the prescription industry. It's massive. Yeah, it is massive. And so this is this whole change of what people want, what people feel good with, and even the concept of explanation of why I'm sick and why this should happen has changed. So when I grew up in the 50s in medical school in the 60s, everyone took the scientific explanation as being the explanation, but by the end of my time, when somebody asked why, I'd have to quietly find out what they thought an explanation was.
I suppose that's moving from this post-tradition, almost post-reason to a degree, the post-structure of what this sort of stuff is influencing. Because I'm more in control, my allegiance is to me and to my worldview.
Yeah. I mean, taking the case of our parents, I think they had more faith in medicine than we have, actually, to be honest. Okay, they take the medicine and pills, we question it. Okay, we'll question you about, are you sure that's going to work? You know what I mean? So there has been a shift in just our generation, even though we're the 60s, we're generationally different than our parents who, just believed it, or accepted it. Yeah.
And I suppose we are living, even in the school system, is far more questioning today than maybe 30 years ago.
Yes.
There's more room to question. And that's part of my individual choice now. It's almost an entitlement. Rather than us going through school and respecting the tradition and the institution. And I think that's part of this.
Yeah, we were brought up to question in our schooling. And you would have been too.
Yeah, to a degree.
Yeah, to a degree. But in your reading, in your history and stuff like that, it was a certain amount of rote stuff, but then later on at high school you were definitely taught to question.
Yeah.
That lady over there.
No, I was just going to say what Rob said.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
To encourage to question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mark?
I'd just like to challenge a couple of carried on amongst this idea called church and what it really means.
What are you saying about it?
Well, it's not a original scripture idea, ecclesia is, but church isn't. And church is such an abrogated word in terms of what it really means. Does it mean the service or the building or the group of people who go and I think Phil and I have some common ancestry in the sense we both belong to a group together. In that group I was the only nominal believer in the God of the Bible, I think. Might have been one other, I'm not sure, Phil.
You stood out.
I was the one that was prepared to
You talking about skeptics?
No, there was a group called Mindset, but Laurie Eddy comes here sometimes, was sort of took over.
What was it?
Mind Circle it was called, but Laurie didn't start it, he sort of took it over. Anyway, in that group, I reckon more than half of people who've been in the traditional denominations, Anglican, I don't remember the Catholics, but some others, who'd seen that, didn't believe it, and had moved to, they'd sort of thrown out the baby with the bathwater. And I reckon that's the area of greatest hope, is that there's a whole lot of people who've accepted affluenza as the solution, or retirement planning, or whatever else, that, ordering of their lives, who really have a deep spiritual need, but who haven't had the guidance or the help to be able to actually activate it. And I think that's why
I agree with you. And I think it's a crisis that will trigger that.
And I think that crisis for me is that the denominations are dying. That's as I see it.
And so maybe God's less worried about that than most of us.
What's that?
And so what you're maybe implying is that God's less worried about that than a lot of us. If denominations die.
God, do you? Yeah.
Hey?
I don't speak for God, do you?
Maybe occasionally, but I'm certainly not claiming that at the moment.
He's not speaking ex cathedra. But, yeah.
No lightning strikes yet?
Yeah.
Okay.
But you're saying kind of the church structure can get in the way.
Absolutely. And what I'd like to quote is a guy called Frank Viola, and he's not the only one. I found about 7 or 8 authors who are writing about this. Frank's probably the most prolific and the most articulate about it. But he's saying, let's get back to what it was like, which was gatherings of people without the structures, without the hierarchies, none of that stuff. And dare I say it here, without the educational structures. I mean, I'm not trying to stick pins in or anything. I'm just really glad to come here and talk about these things. But yeah, well, Frank's written 2 books that I would like to recommend. One's called Pagan Christianity with a question mark, and he traces a lot of the structures and rituals that have gone on in the denominational churches and shows where they've come from, and it fortunately puts pagan Christianity with a question mark. And the other, that's the deconstructor, so that really, and he said if he'd known how hard it was going to be, he would have never written it. It's got 300 references in the bibliography, so it's a major work, quite small but a major work. And the other one he's written is called Revised Again, which I haven't read, but where he talks about the path of reconstruction, and really it's getting more back to what the first century Acts style church was. I mean, I'm not, what's the word, doctrinaire about it. I plan to go to West Coast and East Coast and a few other places where some of these organisations have formed and just see if they're real.
Organisations, did you say?
Well, where people are gathering is what I'm trying to say. I agree. It's not an organisation. Where people are gathering. And just see if they're real, see if they're, or whether they're just pretend. Well, an organisation has some structure. It's not without structure. It's just the degree of structure and the degree of control of it. And his thesis is, there's the Almighty, and then we're all equal below him, and that's how it should be. And we will gather in twos and threes and more. And
there's a lot more around it.
Wasn't like that in the New Testament. Wasn't like that in the New Testament.
No, it wasn't.
Say it again.
It wasn't like that in the New Testament.
What wasn't like what?
All equal, everyone equal. It wasn't like that.
Wasn't it?
Every place there were elders or bishops appointed. Every place, and it even seems beyond that there was some significant influence from the Jerusalem church over others. It was very clear from reading Acts of the Apostles that there was organisation in every individual church, wherever they were established.
I'd like to read leadership, and then I'll have another tour. Get a bit educated.
Like in 1 Corinthians 14, like it says, let several people speak and let them be questioned and all that sort of thing. Well, that sort of thing doesn't go on in most churches, does it?
Unless you're Baptist.
No.
Read some biology, and I'd love to have another tour.
Well, I've read Acts, and I've read Acts.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, no, you interpreted Acts. That's how I put it.
But I think when you travel, so I mean, I haven't covered that much, but particularly in Ireland, where the church did spread out into the rest of Europe, surprisingly, and they kept the faith going. They had a structure. They had leaders, St. Columbine, and people like that were famous, and there was a leadership, a structure there, and they all congregated together. But they weren't equals, like you said. There was somebody that had the authority to pass down the knowledge or keep the teaching straight, if you like, and that's what Paul was even on about. He was.
So the Catholic Church is a good example of, lots and lots and lots of people being involved, and that's not a measure for me.
But then you've got, much as though I'm a rebel, my wife will say I'm a rebel, but you've then got the thing where people can express their own ideas. We're doing Revelation at the moment, and it's a difficult book, and I don't necessarily agree with it, but it does talk about those teachers that are doing different things, and unless you've got some structure of authority, then you'll just get a big mass,
I don't want to have too much to say, but I've got very interested in agile development. I've got a software background, I'm an entrepreneur, and I'm very interested in that. And a lot of the productivity gains there are because of destructuring. In other words, within the development team, there's no hierarchy, there's no seniority. People are just working together as a self-organising team. And my hope is...
Sorry, we could take that offline.
What's that?
We can take that offline. I'll debate that one.
That's definitely debatable. Australians are flat organisations, but they still have a hierarchical structure. You can have equals, and you can have people working at different levels at various times, but there's a clear authority type setup that goes on.
I think we have to be careful we're not kind of wandering off.
But it's also analogous to the church, what he's talking about, what the church he's trying to propose.
I think,
but I guess the question is,
the gifts are not being used, and I think that's his major point. Is that so many gifts are just being suppressed in this model of a preacher and people sitting in there and singing the hymns, following the order of service, and the gifts are not being released.
I think that's an important issue to be exploring. It doesn't matter the context, because I think we've professionalised the clergy and our training, and we're working hard here to try to break that. Not to deconstruct the church, but try to get leaders who can move beyond that old practices within Christendom to actually harness those around, because if you don't harness them, you lose them. And I think that's a challenge for us, is because we're going to need everyone on the ground. We're going to need everyone participating.
One of the things about this group is basically a lay organisation.
Yeah.
There's no money. Nobody gets paid. We're good for nothing. So we're actually trying to encourage mobilising the laity. But
Because this conversation should actually be inside local congregations and not sort of on the side as a modality or sort of, is that the right word, modality? Get those confused. Where it's separate to the church. This conversation should be happening within.
Well, we're not separate to the church necessarily right now.
Church.
No, but within our local congregations, right, providing the drive for these things.
Here anyway.
Did you have a question, Phil?
Oh, some time back I did, but I don't think it's relevant then.
You mean you've forgotten what it is?
All I was going to say is I have to admit I am a Richard Dawkins fan. I've been reading him for some time, listening to his tapes, and one of the things that I've learnt from him that he brought up was the idea that faith is something that was taught by the churches to people and to many, and to myself as a little kid before I had any idea what it was about, and that faith was a virtue. And he maintains that faith is not a virtue. And he talks between your worldview, and your worldview can be based on faith. And therefore you can be a Muslim and a Christian and a Hindu and whatever country you happen to be born in, that's your faith, and that's when you go and kill the other characters. That's where he sees it as not a virtue. But he says that the other worldview is based on evidence-based, and we shouldn't believe anything unless we have evidence for it. We can speculate, but we say we speculate. And that's meant a lot to me. And the idea is, as I see it, is that the church, that the whole idea of the church is based on faith and it's breaking up and you're getting these new age people and all that, but they're based on faith as well. The whole thing is based on faith. You've got this big group of people all based on faith, which means they happen to believe something but don't necessarily have any evidence for it. And in my experience of going to churches, they don't require evidence, they don't want evidence, they're just happy with the way they go.
Right, so that's working on the definition of faith as belief without evidence.
Without evidence, yes.
Yeah.
And the other one with evidence-based reasoning, he points out how little children are their beliefs are based on evidence. When they play with their little toys and in the water and sand and whatever, that human beings naturally have a tendency to believe in evidence when it's presented to them, and to be able to then cooperate with other people because you've got something you can convince them about. But if it's just based on faith, then you're likely to have conflicts and disagreements for millennia. And because there's no grounds on which to separate, to be able to come to a conclusion. But if it's based on evidence, which doesn't really mean science-based stuff, but if it's based on evidence, then you can reason together and come to a conclusion. And that's what...
Well, that's what reasonable faith's all about.
Sorry?
That's what reasonable faith is all about. It's evidence for what you believe.
Yes. Well, the faith, as I see it in the church, and in the church, people just simply believe something they've been told.
It often happens, yeah.
That's the norm, as far as I'm concerned, and that was my norm, as far as I'm concerned.
But do you think that's true, that the preponderance of the majority of the church is belief without evidence?
I think in our individual age, people are in those communities because there's some truth about what works. Some of that pragmatic stuff. People are making choices about products that are on offer because someone's recommended it or there's things that have happened. And I think that even happens in the Christian world with people inside. Your life has changed. What's happened? I've had an encounter with Jesus. And that sparks all sorts of questions that have taken place. Now, some of these may not actually be in the Western world. I'm talking from stuff from some of my networks in Africa and Asia as well. It doesn't mean the West has got the mortgage on this area. Either some of my African and Nigerian and Middle Eastern friends. There's stuff like that where there's been a real transformation take place or something's really happened that is just at a human level is unexplainable, but to them it's evidence. right? And I think part of the challenge is how we process that personalised evidence, which is maybe seen from the outside as faith without evidence, but for them it's actually evidence.
I'd like to say that a common seemed to be just you talking tonight and all people talking, not going to church is regarded as evidence of something about someone's Christianity, and that to me is false evidence.
Or negative evidence against it, yeah.
Well, it's not, you know, you can't say that because someone's not going to church, they're not going to have faith, or they're not.
No, that's not what I'm saying.
No, I know.
That's not what I'm saying.
But it is used that way. Oh, which church?
Well, it's yeah.
Oh, you still go to church. Oh, you're not going. Oh, okay. And then the cultural aspects come in, and oh, you're not going to church. Does that mean?
Can I just make a quick relation? I listen to Dawkins and the Hitchens, and I read Harris and all those guys, right? And one thing that Dawkins had on his blog last year, which relates directly to what you're talking about, and I always suspected the second point here, but I just had recent confirmation of it from one of his colleagues at Oxford. And that was, the first thing is, he talked about when he was soft abused by the clergy at his church. This is on Dawkins' blog. So that's to the point of what's one of the most factors of people leaving. I mean, this guy's the major thorn and influencer in the Western world. That's one factor which you've already identified. And the second
You're saying that he was abused by the clergy when he was
I'm telling you, he was saying that he was he was soft-handled, fondled, that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
His words. It's on his blog. You can look it up.
All right, okay.
So that was one thing. So there's the effect of the church abuse again, and because he was raised Anglican, I believe.
Yeah.
And secondly, he got so irate after the Iraq War, and so there's the war and the killing and the not living to the standards. They're the two things that actually have influenced the influencer. So I think that's germane to your presentation.
Just going back to what you were saying, and the topic tonight being about Australian spirituality, do you see a spirituality in that?
What Richard said.
No, I'm talking about you.
Oh.
In what I guess, yeah, like in what he was saying about non-faith being as you define the term, non-faith being a virtue. Questioning him. Do you see a spirituality in that?
I see a worldview coming for myself, a worldview coming from that, and a worldview which I would have shunned and which I have described as being in a dark place, but which I have worked through, and I've come out, I wouldn't say in the glorious sunlight, because I'm not going to heaven any time soon, but it's an understanding of the world of how wonderful it is, and evolution, brutal but very effective, but it's a wonderful thing that we have come through a process of gradual evolution, and our minds and our emotions and our spiritual things are physically based, they're part of our brain.
So it does give you a sense of awe and wonder.
Awe and wonder for sure, and that's, I would say, that's spiritual.
Yeah, that's
but
what I was wondering.
It's not related to anything supernatural.
Mm.
And it's just real. It's a real thing.
Yes, sir.
The Western world, although there's been tensions, and when we read in the media about things, there's always things of concern. They're always trying to sell papers, of course, and advertising space on TV. But nonetheless, ever since World War II, or even before that, really the Western world has had an unprecedented growth in affluence and relative peace, growth of science, medicine and everything. Lives are generally in the whole Western world so much richer in that respect, and safer, less, everything, so I think that's been, while that's been going on, and we've seen this great decline, what do you think might happen if and when some great reverse comes? If there's some serious economic dislocation, which could easily happen, I don't just mean, like Holden's closing down or something like that, but some really serious...
serious depression, which we haven't had since the 30s.
That's right. Now, what happens when that happens and it's extended, And there's also hostility of a scale. You know, we get anxious about a bit of terrorism here and there and everything.
Well, it's interesting.
What's going to happen?
It's interesting. Sorry, I mean, I suppose it's hard because you can't generalise this. But if you look at the common practice across the churches and their practice of actually,
It's a lot of common practice.
yeah.
So do you
But-
think, do you think that there's not action in following Jesus' teaching? The evidence is not there that they actually followed Jesus, and
The transformation hasn't taken place.
Yeah.
The conversion, the genuine
Yeah.
conversion. We are called to renew our minds on a daily basis, not to be conformed to the patterns of this world.
but also in actions as well.
Yeah, by the way we treat each other, the way we
Yeah,
speak.
that's right. And
From
the
memory,
way
is up the list.
we sacrifice, or practice. I mean, I don't want to give up my, good life and go out somewhere. It's very hard. But, well, I don't have to, but I mean, there is that calling to do that. And, well,
Yeah, I mean, Christianity, to be honest, if it's lived to what it was intended to be, is countercultural for our age.
Yeah.
There's so many dynamics of our calling that are now contrary to what's in our society. If people really saw the difference Christ made in our lives, in the way we think, the way we process the world. I'll give you one example. It's a few years ago now, but in our school setting, it was a week after 9/11, and I was travelling to Thailand for a conference with Americans, we're Americans and all that. And we were able to say we were not scared. Right? People were telling my wife she should cancel my ticket and shouldn't go, etc., etc. Why should I be scared when I'm with God? God's in control of this. You know, and so the whole idea of our theology
But
and
I get scared.
Sorry?
I get scared. And
I think it's
I've got God.
Yeah.
So sometimes, you've got to be careful with that as well, because then people go, oh, I'm scared. Therefore, maybe I'm not with God. Oh no, now I'm not scared.
No, I really get what you're saying.
I think it's I still went nervous.
Yeah.
You still got to be then careful how you manage that.
Yeah.
But there's a sense of fear can bind us and hold us back and do nothing in it. But there's a trust. Fear is trusting God is actually is it an antonym of fear? I don't know whether you can, but there's almost an extent of some of that now. There's being scared. There's being scared, which I think is different to being fearful.
Like when they were in the boat on the rough sea and Jesus was calm, they were frantic. And I believe the same thing happened to the Wesleys and the Moravians in a storm. And they were scared, and the Moravians recognised that they weren't born again. They helped them to
I suppose it's like Jesus. Jesus was asleep in the boat when the storm was on. And that's the sort of thing where you're relaxed and you're content in process. You're still nervous and you're thinking what's going to happen, but it doesn't stop you, but you can still step out in faith, in belief that this is where God wants to go. So you're not allowing these things to beat us. And that's where I learned a lot from my Nigerian brothers and sisters who suffered this on a regular basis.
David, does the truth matter, or is pragmatism the way to go?
Careful how you answer that.
Just say yes.
No, it's not as it's more complex than that, I think. Because I think truth is, if you look at our diagram on culture that I showed, if you had our worldview is our allegiance to Jesus, from our beliefs come our values that impact our behaviour. Right? So for me, the pragmatism is not to just do, but that truth should be impacting our pragmatism. It should be informing our behaviour. Because that's where the truth is lived out there, enacted. It's enacted, and I think that's where we haven't drunk, because we've said these things and then we've done something different. And that's what I was talking about, authentic life. That if you were
high on the list of
if you really believe this, then what does it actually mean in action? So we talk as Christians, everyone knows love one another. Well, we're as divisive as any community. So if you're looking for something, is that a witness to what we...
Same divorce rate.
I always believed in God until I became a Christian. And then I suddenly had all these doubts. And so questions arose, is it actually true? And so this was the kind of the big issue for me, because I'm kind of engineer, scientist type thing. And I thought that it was the same for everybody else. So I thought, if I could actually show another person that it was true, then they would become a Christian. And so I saw that this was the big issue, true. But is that because I'm weird? Does everybody else in Australia kind of think, they're a nice group of people, so I believe what they believe? Like, does that sort of...
Does everyone, I'll throw an example. Does everyone think Brett Lee's nice when he sells wheat bix?
Yeah, good smile.
Oh, I don't know. I can't answer the question.
But that's the sort of thing, we have a product where we get someone up there to sell the product.
Yeah.
On the basis of who they are.
Yeah.
But hang on, I'm hoping that you're assuming that Wheat Bix is a good product.
Yeah. Oh yeah, definitely. Okay. Definitely. But it's the sort of thing, our witness is we're the walking billboard.
Yeah. But that goes to your first points, when we're hypocritical.
Yeah. That kills the message.
And that was my point about Dawkins. And every time, and then the next thing they'll bring up is slavery and blah blah blah. And it's very hard, that signal to noise ratio. It's very hard. When that hypocrisy is so high, it's hard to actually explain the truth.
So you're saying we should concentrate on being nice people rather than showing that it's true?
No. It's living the heart. It's
being authentic.
It's the authenticity of the depth of our faith. Now we talk about grace. Grace is a big part of our theology. So what does grace look like when I speak to you, or when I speak to the person at the checkout, when I'm buying my products, when I'm dealing with the guy who's really offended me?
Can I sharpen that? What does grace look like when it's a legal question, say like keeping the chaplains in the school that really annoys everybody? What does grace look like?
Like in that conversation, how do we dialogue with people and maintain our thing? Like you were saying before, or someone was saying how with some of those guys in the collective new atheism community are far more aggressive. To me, that puts me off. If I was a their aggression and that is a turn off.
Yeah, but
watching it, but that doesn't. So that to me is the way we can still hold our position and still be gracious. Now, some people would say when Jesus turned the tables in the temple with aggression.
But not nice.
No, so that
I sharpened the reason because I think Kevin asked a really good question. Where is truth? And you can either represent truth and go and fight for our kids because you're fighting for our kids with the chaplaincy. And I'm taking a little less political than the other example that I could think of right at the moment. But friends and colleagues got so cross about that. Didn't know anything about it, right? But got so cross because of what they thought they knew about it. How do you show grace and dialogue when you're going to the courts to actually try and keep that program funded? What do you do with that? So how do you? This is the tough question: truth or pragmatism? Which one do you do? Pragmatism is you leave it and you go, okay, let's not worry about federal funding. Truth is no, our kids actually need this program because frankly, it was actually just to keep them out of jails in the first place. Truth or pragmatism? Sometimes it's a choice.
Be wise as serpents and harmless as doves.
Yeah. And there's a sense of where there's fight. You can still fight graciously, I think. You can still be firm in your beliefs, but do away. See, to me, that idea of acceptance is about esteeming the other still, even if we disagree. Right? A legal court is working out the content and trying to work out the path.
Okay, to your point then, on the first one, signal to noise, when the other person is offended by you going to court, and that's the point at which you're basically doing people cutting off their ears and they're no longer listening to you, right? Where's truth and pragmatism in that? Sorry, I'm trying because
this is tough.
The theory is really, really easy. It's the practice that's damn hard.
Yeah, and that's where we need to then be praying. You need the trust of the Spirit's leading. There's so your whole spiritual walk in leading to that decision.
And there is an assumption that that's God's will, what you're saying, that the chaplain should be there, and that's an assumption. And I'm not necessarily agreeing with that.
No, I wasn't making that assumption
Well, I think
because
you are.
because
You know,
I'm
fighting for that particular
I wasn't. I'm more like you try and do the good works that God's prepared for you, but you don't always know if it's what you should be doing or whatever, right? I mean, you know, pray but move your feet.
But offences will come, won't they? I mean, if you're going to speak the truth of God's word, you're bound to offend somebody. That doesn't mean to say that you're being ungracious just because someone's got offended.
Well, what if they're taking it that way? The moment
It's the way you handle that critique. Because in some ways it's a critique, but there's a sense of where Jesus said to the disciples, would go out 2 by 2. If there's no response, dust your sandals, move on.
So by the time you go to court, what's that? You've already taken a posture. You've already done something that's potentially not gracious. You've already gone down a whole lot of path.
Yeah, it depends on there's a.
Is that any different from a legal fight against slavery? Against big corporations? Or vested interest in slavery, where there was legal battles going on and they got very offended?
I agree.
It's interesting, this love makes the way group. It's an interesting one at the moment as well.
It's also, I think, just trying to say, choose your battles too.
Yeah.
Is it worth, you know, in business, court is your last resort. If you haven't sorted it out by mediation, or the shake of the hand or something like that. I worked in Chile for a while. I was the project manager, and it's law. It's the form of law there that the first line of a dispute is the two managers sign an agreement that they will go into a room and sort out the issue and come out with an agreement that's binding to both parties. And I had to sign that. It was quite scary, you know. But fortunately, there was no dispute or anything like that. But it's an interesting concept, you know.
And I think there's a whole lot around on us thinking of what, like our worldview is where we've come from Christendom, where we've been the dominant group. We're moving into a period where potentially we're becoming the minority. There's a whole lot in our thinking that has to change as a result of that change in position.
And that's the purpose of my question.
Which is what we've got to grapple with. But I don't think it's...
But where do we get at? I'm not seeing good dialogue or good direction or even this sort of conversation on not what, but even how we should be approaching some of these contentious issues.
But I think it's issue by issue.
I think there's information coming out tonight. Maybe you didn't get it, but you know. I want to ask about Hindu.
I think it's also... Sorry, can I just finish? I think it depends on the issue and what those values are behind it. I don't think it's clear cut to work towards just to a court.
No.
As it is the issue, it depends on what the issue is, and there's a whole lot around our thinking of what it means to be the minority when others are the majority, and is it our right to expect, you know, there's a whole lot around that. But I think that we've got to explore because we've never been in that position. But I go to my Middle Eastern brothers and sisters or those who have lived as Christians in some of those countries for guidance, and that they'll speak into our world. And the diaspora coming into Australia will be speaking into our world because they were helping us.
This is a quickie. At the bottom of one of the slides, it said that Hinduism is the fastest growing of the religions.
In Australia?
In Australia.
Because of Indian migration.
Those growth of those religions are migration primarily.
It's just about migration.
There is conversion and there is marriage.
But mostly it's migration.
Basically it's migration. But don't get scared of migration because the data would show 58% of those coming into Australia are still would nominate Christian in census.
I'm not scared of migration.
So over 50%. Now that's still a lot. There's still a dominant England, UK, New Zealand type group in that.
The British people coming here tend to be the no religion, but it's lots of African Christians are coming in.
There's Middle East Syrians and that sort of.
At this stage, I better close formal proceedings. And
can I just say,
you'd be happy to just so people have the freedom to go. But you'd be happy to hang around a bit and address questions.
A couple of books. One is Gary Boehmer's book, if you want to read more on Australia and the Soul, called The Australian Soul by Gary Boehmer. Hugh Mackay has written some good stuff. He's a good read in terms of some of more the sociological sort of factors in that. Advanced Australia Where.
Right, okay.
And I think one other And there's a couple from CRA, Christian Researchers, and NCLS around this sort of thing who've tried to study it a bit. One called Spirit Matters by Peter Cowdor and Philip Hughes, some of you there, and Shaping Australia's Spirituality, which was a Philip Hughes book as well. But one book that I think is really significant for us is by Tim Foster. He's an Anglican from Sydney, so everyone jumps in and thinks. But he talks about the suburban captivity of the church, which is along some of these lines of the Christian sort of structural church thing, the traditional church, that we've been caught on some values around family and domestication and things like that. And that's actually holding us back in terms of reaching other groups. He went into inner Sydney and didn't meet anyone who agreed with those values, so he met... And so he had to rethink, how does the gospel fit? So that's a good read if you want to think about some of that sort of line, some of these values that are actually holding us back in this conversation. So thank you for having me, and
yeah,
thank you.
Yeah.